All right, hello everyone. Hi, I'm here today with Dr. Andreas Horn, who's sitting with us in Berlin. Hi, Andreas. How are you today? Could you please quickly just introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us what it is that you do in this weird and wacky world of ours?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. So I am a researcher in the field of DBS, deep brain simulation. I have been in that field for around 10 years now. I have done a little bit of clinical training as well in neurology, but I'm not a practicing physician. So I'm an MD, but more on the research side, at least these days. And I lead a small group in Berlin, and we focus on localizing deep brain stimulation electrodes and then finding out, where they should be for optimal effects, or where they should not be for side effects, and things like that in various diseases, including Parkinson's disease, but also different indications. And yeah, that's
Okay, awesome.
the gist of it.
Now, on that last topic, something that I, as a patient, often am asking myself, something that I'm often seeking in the course of my studies of Parkinson's and the people that I interact with is, who are the real experts in any given field? Now, Parkinson's itself is a very varied condition, and there's so many subdisciplines within Parkinson's itself. Every time I come across somebody who there's so many people that think of themselves as experts in this thing called Parkinson's. And whenever I hear that, I think it's kind of silly to some degree, because Parkinson's, for one, it doesn't really exist. And for the other thing, there's so many subdisciplines, which is why I was kind of very happy to hear that of yours. You have this very specialized expertise in this one small domain. And I feel like that's the way that things should work. People should not claim to be kind of experts in everything and anything Parkinson's. They should, pick their niche and then push that niche forward as far as we possibly can. In your interactions with other scientists and other researchers, how would you determine who a real expert is in any given area? And then what would be your advice to a patient, let's say, who's trying for themselves, without the scientific background, to figure out who are the experts, who should they trust and who should they not trust with any given question that they might have?
That's a very, very good question, and I don't know if I can answer that at all. But I guess I brought that up in our talks before, that I was a bit anxious you interviewing me, because I am not a clinical expert at all, and in many things I'm definitely not an expert, probably in all things. And there's really this very, very, as you say, very even, you could even say, stupid thing, or very small thing that I focus on, which is just space. Where and then where's the electrode? What might it lead to? So it is nothing complex. It's nothing complicated, and that maybe I think I by now could be considered an expert, just because I spent so much time and years on that. But it's being an expert on such a small thing is not a big deal. Anybody could achieve that. So I agree with you to some degree that it should be hard to find experts on broad topics like whole disease. You're probably right that it's way too complicated. So, for example, you certainly know more than me about anything beyond DBS. So let's say, for example, stem cell therapy. I'm sure you know more than me about that. And I still work in that field. So of Parkinson's disease and movement disorders and so on. So and I guess that would apply to nearly everybody. And I guess with increasing age, you can manage to get a broader view. There are people that are quite knowledgeable across many fields, I think. And then, of course, there are, I would say, clinician experts, right, that are really good at looking at movement disorders, quantifying them, describing them, talking about them, deriving clues from that. And I think those are likely the ones that are most interesting to most patients. You're a bit different because you also care a lot about the science and background, right? So maybe many don't even, I don't know. Some do, of course. It just depends on the person. Yeah, and then I guess your main question was to how to define which ones are the ones to trust. And I don't know if it's hard to have a good answer about that. I mean, one thing that one could do is really look at what have they really published on, because publishing on something means at least that you've thought about it quite a long time, you know, at least 1 year or so. And if they have many papers on one topic, they should be quite knowledgeable on that topic, right? So that could be one option.
What about, would you prescribe to any kind of theory where an expert is somebody they don't just understand all of the knowledge that's needed in that specific domain, but they've gotten themselves to the point where they have an intuition that other people just can't grasp because of that, like 10,000 hours or whatever you want to say spent in that one particular subdomain? Would you think that that's a good way of saying, of differentiate? And then,
yeah,
how do you know if somebody actually has that kind of intuition? Because knowledge is a funny thing. I mean, people can understand all of the words in a textbook, but that doesn't mean you understand what the author was trying to say.
Yeah.
So
it's a good point, and I agree with that intuition. So just by, as you say, these magical 10,000 hours. So you know, people that have just seen so many patients with movement disorders, for example, are just good at maybe even feeling, or, you know, getting a good intuition is a good word about what they might have, or how best to help them, at least, and so on. So yeah, I think the only way we can really do if we don't know that person is to talk with them and see if it checks out. You know, if they can convince us with their logic, and then either believe them or not. So we all need a BS filter, you know. If not in this world, you're lost. Yeah, it's hard.
It is hard. Well, I'll say one thing that kind of clued me into, I think, a realization that you are very much an expert in your domain, and that expertise is kind of spilled over into other domains, is something that you wrote. I think an expert is somebody, I think, who's also very good at pointing out, as you just said, what's real and what's not real, what's BS and what's not BS. I can't remember exactly what it was. You sent me a few things, but one of the things that you wrote was about how the brain works, essentially.
Wow. Okay, that's a broad topic. Nobody should be an expert on that, I think.
Yes, but I think we can have intuitions, and I think there's some people that have some very valid intuitions that we need to be taking very seriously. And there's one thing in particular that I think that you said about how in the past we've tried to subcategorize different areas of the brain, and we say, you know, this circuit involves the VTA and the STN and the blah, 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 and it works in this loop, and then we've defined it, and then we can move on to the next thing. And I remember you said, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you said something to the fact of, like, we shouldn't be taking that as literally as it's meant, because it's not literal. And what we should be looking at more importantly is the entire oscillations behind these circuits and behind these networks. I'm wondering if you would be able to expand upon that. Did I interpret that correctly? And second, why do you think we often fall under this like trap of trying? A great way that was put to me, I can't remember who said this, but whether it's geography or neuroscience, anytime you see a straight line, it means it's artificial. It means it's not really there. It means it's something that is just not natural. The brain is not segmented. So that's maybe a roundabout way of saying.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So I totally mesh with that, and I think one potentially crippling thing that many people do is to really think about specific nodes like STN, let's say in cortex or, you know, thalamus, and then say one excites the other one tones down the other, and see it more as a static thing. But that's trying to, you know, analyze something like weather with arrows, and it's a dynamical system. And I think we should always think about oscillations in the brain. So you know, there is no such thing in my view that one region tuning down the other or inhibiting. I mean, of course, neurons inhibit each other, but there's so much dynamics going on that the net effect is not grasped by these wiring diagrams that we sometimes have, let's say, of the basic ganglia. So I think people sometimes take those too literally and try to explain diseases, but also mechanisms of the brain on that level. And I think it's the wrong level to think about the brain, because it's so, always, there's so much going on all the time. So, I mean, there's a good analog with weather. I think that currently we are making most predictions with computer models. And I think the future of neuroscience would be more like that, right? Where we really need computer simulations to make predictions. Nobody would try that with weather anymore with, box and arrow diagrams and try to derive it, how the weather will become tomorrow. And I think we need those models. We don't have them yet, or at least not in good shape, but I think that's the way to go, at least.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another topic that I want to touch on a lot, something that you do a lot of, is trying to visualize what's happening in the brain. I think you have some of the most beautiful diagrams of what we're trying to see here. And there's a lot of things that I'd like to address with this, but I guess to start with, how accurately do those visualizations that you draw or that you create represent what you see when you close your eyes and you think about what's actually happening?
Oh, that's a good point. A good question. I guess they certainly influence my thinking, and it's also the way I try to think. And I think visualization is, a big part of science is communication. It's very important. I think it's not just finding out something, but you also have to spread the word. If you would imagine, you would find out how PCR works, polymerase chain reaction, breakthrough finding, but you wouldn't tell anybody. It's as if it didn't happen, right? So communication is important in science, and I think good way and clear communication is important to make sure we think of concepts the same way, so to synchronize our thinking. And I think sometimes visualizations can deliver that better than just text. And for key concepts, I like to visualize them. I need to see them. I would even like to touch them usually, but that's harder to achieve. But yeah, if I and still these visualizations, they don't represent what the brain really does. It's often just a snapshot. For example, if we visualize one fiber tract that might be associated with optimal outcomes if we simulate it. Again, there's so much more going on. It's a dynamic system, as said, right? So there's so much dynamics in there that we don't see in that picture, but still it could help at that local level to maybe help us see, what is the substrate that we need to modulate at that local level. So it doesn't, visualizations wouldn't have the aim to explain the brain or explain everything, but they would explain a certain specific concept that's important for communication, for other scientists to understand what we think is true or is helpful. So yeah, and so I think that didn't really answer your question, but I think that's exactly the point. I sometimes do them, and that would influence how I see it as well. Right? It would help me wrap up things together and better understand things together myself.
Okay, let me ask you another kind of very related question. Do you think our best models of the brain reside on paper, or do they all exist in the minds of experts such as yourself?
I'm not an expert, again, on that, really not. I feel, but that's not the point. I've recently become a PI, and I think I've started reading much more only now, and that's sad, I know, but I think as a PhD student and postdoc, you often just, work on your own project a lot, and you're up to publishing papers and so on. And I recently thought, reading some books that really, where from people where you really think, okay, these guys have understood a lot of the brain, and then reading them when you're already 36, quite old, is a bit sad, because I would have loved to read them earlier. So, it could be that you're right, that just only finding out who's the right person to ask is the best way to learn as much as possible about the brain. And it can take 30 years to find that expert that knows a lot, right? So where you were younger and you didn't know anybody who knew that. So I guess most is written up somewhere, but maybe it's rather the question, how easy can we find the right stuff to read?
I don't know. I just get a sense that the brain is so complicated. It's such a complex, or maybe I'm not sure if we are giving the brain too much credit in some sense, but it does seem like such a complex system.
It is.
It's so complex that, like, I don't know if any paper could ever capture that kind of complexity because of how there's just so much you'd have to take into consideration if you really wanted to capture it all, and that anybody who might be able to, they would never be able to express that in words, I feel. Which is why I get the sense that if there is anybody out there that really does think that they understand what's going on in the brain, they wouldn't be able to communicate it. I don't think language is suited for something that complex. Because all of language is really just fitting like information onto these frameworks that we already have. I just don't think there's enough nuance in language to capture that much complexity. I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that, but that's just my own thinking about that particular question.
So I get what you're saying, and I agree that language imposes some sort of grid to us. You know, if we want to say it's a bush or it's a tree, there's often nothing in between, you know, so there's not a word for that. But we could then elaborate and say it's something in between of a tree and a bush, you know. So I think language can be powerful, and still it has restrictions and you know, adds concepts to our thinking. So it influences our thinking as well. But I guess you're certainly right. It would be not easy to write one book about the brain that explains it all. But what I'm saying, any expert that would have that kind of knowledge would have still read it somewhere, or, you know, learned it somewhere. So in my view, yeah, it's there won't ever be this one book or paper about the brain that explains it. But there is so much knowledge out there that if you have time to find the right stuff to read, you can potentially learn quite a bit. Yeah.
Would they have, like, if you look at a dissected brain in real life, is the information that you're receiving captured? Like, would you say that there's a paper that can capture the information that you're receiving?
You're right. Yeah, sometimes pictures are needed. You're right, or even videos. Yeah.
But I guess that's why your work is so valuable, I guess, because you are able to give that visual field of.
But I mean, maybe to name one example, I recently started again reading this book by Chris Eliasmith, which is called How to Build a Brain, and I still haven't finished it, unfortunately. I've tried it twice already, but sometimes lack the time to finish things. But that is one tour de force about how one brain would be possible to build, right? That really works, and he has done that, right? He has this model of the brain, it's called Spawn, that does quite a lot of things, like I think 5 different tasks without retraining and so on. And it has, you know, basal ganglia model inside and so on. He has so many insights there that I didn't believe be possible to put into one book alone, and even into one brain like his brain. So that was one of these examples where you think, okay, it took me 36 years to find that person that understands much more about the brain than I would have thought possible. So there are these books that they are hard to find.
Okay. Okay. Now coming back to DBS, I guess a little bit more specifically into therapies. I think one great way of trying to understand these technologies is trying to think about what the limits of them are. And I'm thinking these days a lot about, you know, where's this technology going, and more importantly, what are the upper bound limits of what it's capable of? I guess to answer this question, I would need to learn myself a lot more about electrical dynamics. Well, I don't know if I need to learn more biology or if I need to learn more physics to answer these questions. Which domain of knowledge do you think is most necessary to understand DBS?
So, I mean, I think I've mentioned before, my way of thinking about DBS is really that it is largely toning down something that's overactive. So for, you know, some neural activity that's overactive. So basically it can compensate some overactivity, or it can tone it down. So in order for it to work, you first need that overactive neural activity. So it wouldn't probably do much in a healthy brain. At least it depends on the region, probably. But if I would guess that if you put it into my subthalamic nucleus, probably not as much would happen. So that's why I guess the upper limits would be constrained by the disease, and usually, while we can tone down that overactivity that is maybe inhibiting physiological information flow, that physiological information flow we cannot enhance much, I think. So for example, in dystonia, which is a rare movement disorder that is not neurodegenerative, so it doesn't usually progress much. There we have these very remarkable stories that young children may have it, that without DBS would sit in their wheelchair the whole life, but if they get it, they are sometimes even near symptom-free, and it stays that way. And they make their driver's license and go on, live a happy life and in a normal life. So there it's a rare disease, but in that disease, I think it's amazing what it can do. In Parkinson's as well, but in Parkinson's there is the neurodegeneration that is adding over time, that at some point probably we couldn't compensate even with better ways of DBS, at least if we don't start to really inject physiological information.
So I guess you don't think much about people who think that we can enhance cognition through DBS in any real way?
Exactly. No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, not with DBS in the way we currently do it. So I really think, never say never, but I think DBS in the current shape is really to shut down things that are overactive. So stimulation is a misnomer. And so anything, yeah.
Sorry, I wonder, maybe I should turn off the recording for this next question, but I'll ask it anyways and see what if you want me to turn it off, just let me know. So this is very much self-reporting, I guess. But I find that if I stimulate a more ventral contact on my stimulator, I feel like my cognition is sped up. I feel like I can process information more quickly, but it is more difficult for me to vocalize that information at that time. It's more difficult for me to express myself. How could I test that? How could I, do you know of any way that I could actually prove that that's true? Or is it just something that you think is happening in my head?
So it's a really good point. So maybe I would even add that, we probably can enhance some functions, but usually at a cost of some other symptoms, because you have these things that, sometimes if the left hemisphere is shut down, you are probably faster and sometimes quicker or whatever in certain tasks, but you somehow maybe lose some control over things. So, so I totally agree. It could be possible that by shutting down things, one thing that's maybe adding noise to a process that you say cognitive, being better at or faster at certain things, or your cognition is better, that could certainly be true. But it probably would just mean that some checks and balances in the brain are shut off. That's still interesting. So, it could still, you're right, it could happen that by shutting down one loop, we can augment the function of the other one just because it's, noise-free and so on. It can do whatever thing it does without being obstructed by the other one. So that's certainly possible. And I guess to test it, of course, very interesting, but I think you'd need help because I would do it blindedly. So, it would be perfect if someone else would switch it on and you don't know, and then you do a normal cognitive test, and maybe repeat it on 3 days or something like that. Could be interesting. So, I mean, I don't want to motivate you to self-experiment. So best do it with Alfonso or, your medical team. But there are, of course, these clinical or these research questions that we can try to answer with DBS. And
are you implying that there's there's any kind of danger to turning stimulation on and off rapidly, or playing with the DBS?
No, so not that that I would know or that we would know. So most things we really think are reversible with switching on DBS. So that's at least the current medical knowledge. And of course, there's always some impact on the brain. There's even some impact on the brain if you switch on your light, and there's something happening, of course, in the brain always, but probably nothing permanent. And these checks and balances that I meant were not in terms of something dangerous could happen, but rather that, some of these, so let's assume you have to answer a question, which city is bigger, Manchester or London? And then you would just quickly say London, that's correct, but then there might be this additional system that thinks about it some more. So it's slower, but maybe has some additional value because it would still think, oh, which one has an airport, which one, I don't know, I know better or whatever. So that's maybe what I meant with checks and balances, that if you would shut down such a system, you could probably still be quicker in questions like that. You could think your cognition is better, but it might be that there's, some cost involved. But I don't know, it's interesting. Yeah.
So it might be almost like, I don't know, like some psychedelic trips or getting high even, where you think you have this brilliant idea and then you snap out of it, or you wake up the next morning and you say, wow, it really wasn't that smart to begin with. Okay.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. True.
All right. I guess before I close this off, is there anything else that you wanted us to cover? Is there anything else in particular that you wanted to get at? Is there anything else you wanted to say?
Not particularly. So I mean, I must really applaud you for your work you're doing, and I also find it so interesting to speak with you, because you're a patient that is very interested in what we do. So, and of course, many patients are, but not maybe all of them in such a scientific way and in such a deep way. So it's, also, your work is also focused being a patient advocate, so basically helping patients. But I'm very certain you're also helping physicians to, give feedback, or scientists, and so it's been really interesting to be in touch with you and to follow you. And we have a second conversation planned as well for my podcast. So really looking forward to hearing a bit more about how you're doing after the surgery and so on. So
thank you, me too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, I do have one other question. Now that I think about it, I agree. I think we also need more kind of people with that kind of first-hand knowledge of this in the field. What other kind of when you look at the field of DBS researchers and scientists and doctors even, what are we missing? So what kind of like domains of expertise do we need more of? What would be your advice, I guess, to students who are going into DBS or who are very interested in this technology? What kind of knowledge should they be picking up along the way? What do we need to better understand this technology to help more people down the road?
So, one thing I'm very excited about for the future of DBS is really to, instead of, and that goes quite in line, at least as far as I understand it, with the book you wrote, Brain Fables, and your general also message that there's no single Parkinson's disease, but it's a very heterogeneous disease and everybody has different symptoms and so on. And to map specific connections that are not disease specific but symptom specific in the brain, that something that codes for a specific symptom even across diseases. And we're trying to map these circuits, these symptom specific circuits, and trying to build basically a library of brain symptom circuits that we could then again resynthesize together depending on each symptom a specific patient has, right? So let's say if you're a more tremor dominant Parkinson's disease patient versus one with more bradykinesia, you would then, we could try to, and we are trying to, then modulate the tremor symptom network more than bradykinesia symptom network and so on. And that, of course, these are the main motor symptoms, but that goes a long way, I think, even into psychiatry or neuropsychiatry psychiatric diseases like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and to think about specific loops that are more the obsessions, compulsions symptom, and more maybe the depressive mood symptoms and so on. And then, so I think that's an endless game to try to always refine these symptom-specific networks, better understand them, better understand which circuits really code for which symptom, and then to fine-tune basically in the individual patient and so on. So I guess that's why my answer would be for students that are interested in DBS. I think connectomics or